Welcome to late night calm. Let the light in your room go soft now. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day is behind you, you can set it down. You do not have to carry it into the night. Let your shoulders drop a little lower than they were a moment ago. Let your jaw come unclenched. Let the breath you are holding, the one you did not even notice you were holding, come loose and slow. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is only this quiet voice and a long, gentle journey across a world that ended a very long time ago, told slowly, so that you can drift off inside it whenever you please. Tonight we are going to climb, one slow rung at a time, through the whole of the Mongol Empire. Not the battles, not the great man on the horse that everyone already knows. Instead, we are going to move up through the layers of the people themselves, from the very bottom to the very top. We will begin at a captive's fire on the edge of a moving camp, and we will end, hours from now, in the vast tent of the great Khan himself. And along the way, we will find the one strange thread that tied all of them together. But there is no hurry at all. The empire waited 800 years for us. It can wait while your breathing settles. If these slow journeys bring you some calm, you are always welcome to like, or to subscribe, or to leave a gentle thought below before you sleep. It helps other tired minds find their way here too, one peaceful night, one sleepy soul at a time. That is all. That is the only thing I will ask of you tonight. Now let it go, and let us begin. Here is the thing most people never quite understand about the Mongols. We picture a horde, a wild flood of riders, all loyalty and blood and tribe. But the truth was almost the opposite, and it is far quieter and far stranger than the legend. Because if you had lived under the Mongols, you would not, in the end, have belonged to a tribe at all. You would have belonged to a number. Sit with that for a moment, softly, the way you would turn a smooth stone over in your hand under the blankets. Not a clan, not a bloodline stretching back to some half-remembered ancestor. A number, a 10, 100, 1,000. A share of the spoils owed to you by rule. A distance measured out in days between one resting place and the next. At every single level of this empire, from the lowest to the highest, your life was defined by a number that had been assigned to you. And if you follow that number patiently, from the bottom rung to the top, you follow the whole empire. That is our thread for the night. That is the quiet path we will walk together. So let us start where every empire really starts. At the very bottom, in the dark, at the edge of the fire. Imagine, then, that the worst has happened. Your town, or your camp, or your walled city has fallen. The dust has settled. The noise is over. And you are alive. That, already, is worth pausing on, because you may have expected otherwise. When we think of the Mongols arriving, we think only of ending. But for the ordinary defeated person, the more common fate was not death. It was redistribution. This is a cold word, and I say it softly, but it matters. The people of a fallen place were, as a rule, not simply wiped from the earth in a single stroke. They were parcelled out, divided up, handed down among the Mongol households and the fighting units. The way you might divide a large inheritance among many cousins so that no one part was too heavy for any one household to carry. And so you became a bo'ul. Say the word gently to yourself, the way it would have been said around a fire. Bo'ul. It meant an unfree person. A captive folded into someone else's household, someone else's daily work. You did not own yourself anymore. But you were, in the plainest sense, kept. You were valued the way a good tool or a healthy animal was valued, which is a hard thing to hear, and yet it is also the reason you were still breathing. picture the world you woke into. Not a prison of stone, because the Mongols did not build with stone. Instead, a city that moved. They called the great camp the Ordu, sometimes the Ordo, and it was exactly that, a city, only made of felt and cart and hoof and smoke, and it walked across the grassland like a slow herd of houses. Round tents of thick grey felt, the gur, the yurt, hundreds and then thousands of them, taken down and folded and lashed to carts and set up again a valley over, following the grass and the water the way water itself follows the low ground. Herds spread out around it to every horizon, sheep like scattered clouds, horses standing nose to tail, and woven all through it, at every fire and every cart, the captives. People like you. Your days at the bottom were made of the simplest and heaviest things. You would grind millet between two stones until your shoulders ached, and the sound of it, that low, steady scrape, became the sound of your whole life. You would carry water again and again, from the stream to the tents and back. You would tend the fires, feeding them dried dung, because wood was precious on the open steppe. You would drive the animals, milk the animals, haul, mend, fetch. You belonged to a household, and your worth, plainly and without cruelty and without kindness either, was your usefulness. A person who could work was a person worth feeding. That was the whole arithmetic of it, down there in the smoke. And yet, here is the first quiet turn in our story, the first thing worth staying awake just a moment longer to hear, before you let yourself drift. Not every captive ground millet. There was an exception, and it was not a small one, and it may be the single most important thing to understand about how these people conquered so much of the world. Because when a city fell, the Mongols did not treat all its people as one undivided mass. They sorted. They looked deliberately and carefully for skill. And the skilled were pulled out of the doomed crowd and set aside like treasure. Think of what that meant on the ground. An artisan, a person whose hands knew how to work metal, or weave, or throw a pot true and thin. A scribe, someone who could read and write and keep the letters and the accounts that a growing empire suddenly, desperately needed. A doctor. And above all, the engineers. The men who understood siege works, the great machines that throw stones and break walls. Many of these were Chinese to begin with, and later many were Persian, and the Mongols, who had no such craft themselves, gathered them up as the most precious of all their winnings. These people were not killed, they were counted and kept, and very often sent east, all the long way back to Mongolia, or attached to the moving army to lend it their minds. So here is the thought I want to leave with you at the bottom of the ladder, a thought that runs exactly against everything the legend tells you. If the Mongols captured you, and you had a skill, a real one, something your hands or your mind could do that another could not, you were probably going to live, and more than live. You might rise. The empire did not run on terror alone, whatever the stories say. It ran, quietly and hungrily, on absorbed talent, on gathered-up cleverness, taken from every place it touched and put to work. Terror opened the gate, but it was usefulness that decided whether you walked through it into a grave or into a whole new life. We will find where that new life could lead a little later, higher up the ladder. For now, simply let that sit, gently, even at the very bottom, in the smoke and the grinding stone. There was a thread leading upward, if you had something to offer. Hold that quiet, hopeful thing, and let us climb one rung. Now imagine you were not captured at all. Imagine, instead, that you were born to this world. You were born a Mongol, out on the open grass, under a sky so wide it has no edges. You were, in their own word, an arat, a commoner, a herder, one of the countless ordinary nomad families whose whole existence was the animals and the grass and the seasons and the sky. This was the great broad base of everything, the ground the entire empire stood upon. And it is here, in the herder's ordinary life, that we meet the number for the very first time. Because you, Arat, did not simply live in a family or a clan or a tribe. You lived in a 10, a squad of 10 men, together with their families, their tents, their herds. The Mongols called this smallest unit the arban, the 10, and every ordinary household on the steppe was slotted, deliberately, into one. I want to slow right down here, because this is the quiet hinge on which the whole empire turns, and it is easy to say quickly and miss entirely. So let us breathe and take it gently. Before Genghis Khan, the steppe was a place of tribes and clans, each loyal first to its own blood, its own chief, its own ancient name. Loyalty ran along the lines of family, backward through the generations. Tangled and fierce and forever feuding. And then, in the year 1206, at a great assembly called the Kurultai, where the peoples of the steppe gathered and raised Temujin up and named him Genghis Khan, he did something that was, in its way, more revolutionary than any battle he ever fought. He took the old tribe and he dissolved it. He resorted the people. He took men who had been born to different tribes, old enemies even, families who had raided and hated one another for generations, and he mixed them together, on purpose, into these new units of 10. So that the man on your left in your arban and the man on your right might come from a bloodline your grandfather had feuded with. And the point of that mixing, the whole cold genius of it, was this. Your loyalty could no longer flow backward to a tribe, because your tribe had been scattered across 100 different 10s. Your loyalty now flowed to your unit, to your 10, and, through your 10, all the way up to the Khan himself. The old web of blood was quietly cut, and a new web of numbers was laid over the whole steppe in its place. And that 10 of yours was not a loose thing, not a name only. It bound you. The men of an arban were held responsible for one another, mutually, as one body. If one of your 10 turned and fled from a battle, and the other 9 did not stop him, all of you could be punished for it. If some of your 10 were captured by the enemy, the rest were obliged to try to win them back. To desert your 10, to abandon the 9 men counting on you, was among the gravest things you could do, a matter that could cost you your life. I will say gently here, as I will say all through the night, that much of what we know of these hard rules comes to us second-hand, from writers who set it down long after, so we hold the exact words a little loosely. But the shape of it is clear enough, and it is this. You were not one man alone under that enormous sky. You were one of 10, and the 10 rose or fell together. Let that settle over you like a heavy blanket. 10 men and their families moving as one across the grass, bound to each other by law and by the counting. There is, if you turn it the right way in the dark, something almost warm in it. You were never truly alone. Someone was always counting you, always keeping your place, always coming back for you. And what was the daily texture of that life, in your 10, on the open steppe? It was the animals. The Mongols spoke of the 5 snouts, the 5 kinds of beast that were the whole of their wealth and their food and their movement. Horses, first and always, the horses that were the very soul of the steppe, then sheep, then goats, then cattle, and the camels for the dry places and the long hauls. Everything you had, everything you were, walked on 4 legs and grazed. Your wealth was not coins in a box. It was breath and hoof spread out around your tents to the edge of sight. From those animals came the food that filled your days and your children's bellies. So much of it was dairy, the milk of the herds turned, by patient hands, into things that would keep. There was a rule, curd dried hard in the sun, little pale stones of it that you could carry and gnaw on for days on a journey, sour and firm and lasting. And there was the drink, the great drink of the steppe, irag, which some call kumis, fermented mare's milk, faintly sharp, faintly sparkling, slightly warming, poured and shared and passed around the fire. Milk from the horse, drunk under the stars. And meat, when a beast was slaughtered, shared out and dried, and used to the very last of it. Because on the steppe nothing was wasted, ever. This was your table. Simple, portable, born entirely from the herds, moving with you wherever the grass led. And you moved with the seasons, the way the whole living world of the steppe moved. Between the summer pastures and the winter shelters, up to the high grass when it was green, down to the sheltered valleys when the cold came howling. Your home came apart and folded onto carts, and went with you, felt walls and hearth and all, and rose again wherever the grazing was good. You were not tied to a single patch of ground the way a farmer was. Your roots were in motion itself. But here, Arat, is the thing about you that the world would come to fear, and it is the last quiet turn of this first part of our climb, so let it be the thing you carry down into sleep. You, the ordinary herder, the milker of mares, the counter of sheep, the man of the 10. You were also the soldier. There was no separate army in this world, none. There was no class of professional fighting men kept apart from the people, fed and housed to do nothing but war. There was only you. Every able-grown man was, when the Khan called, a cavalryman. The very same 10 that was your herding squad, your neighbours, the men bound to you by the counting. That 10 was also your fighting unit when the horns sounded. You brought your own horses. You brought your own gear, the composite bow that you had drawn since you were a child, small enough to ride a sheep, the bow layered from horn and wood and sinew, made for the saddle. The skills that fed you were the very skills that made you deadly. The riding, the shooting from horseback, the endurance of a life lived outdoors in wind and cold. War, for the Mongol, was not a strange and separate thing. It was daily life, pointed in a single direction, and you did not ride to war on one horse. This is the small, astonishing detail I want to leave in your mind as your thoughts begin to soften and slow. A single Mongol rider commonly went to war with a string of horses of his own. 3, 4, sometimes 5 mounts brought along together, and as one tired beneath him, he would change to the next, and to the next, without ever truly stopping. Think of what that meant. An army in which no man had to halt for his horse to rest, because there was always a fresh horse waiting under him. An army that could keep moving when any other army in the world would have had to stop and make camp. A tide of riders, each trailing his own little herd of remounts, flowing across the land faster than word of them could travel ahead. And every one of those riders was a herder first, an arat, a man of a 10, counted and placed in the great new order of things. So there you are, on the second rung of our long ladder, no longer a captive at the bottom, but not yet anywhere near the top. A free herder under the open sky, bound into your 10, drinking arag by the fire, your string of horses grazing in the dusk, your bow within reach. Belonging, for the first time in the history of your restless people, not to the old tangle of tribe and blood, but to a number. to an arban of 10. And that number, small as it is, the humblest number in the whole empire, is the first single link in a chain that will rise as we climb through the hours ahead, all the way up to the tent of the great Khan. But we will not climb any further just yet. Stay here a while, in the herders' camp, where the fires are burning low and the horses are settling and the whole vast counted world is quiet under the stars. Let your breathing find the slow rhythm of a camp at rest. There is so much more of the ladder above us, so many more rungs, the artisans and the commanders and the guards and the great riders of the relay roads. They are all still to come, and they will wait for you, patiently, exactly where they are. There is nothing you need to reach for tonight. Only the low fire and the wide sky and the gentle counting of the tens, going on and on across the grass, whether you are awake to hear it or not. And whether you understand it or not, either, because the counting you are drifting inside of. The tens laid over the grass like a net of quiet arithmetic was not always there. It is younger than the hills, younger than the horses, younger even than some of the old men still dozing by the fires around you. There was a year, a single gathering, when the world you now belong to was made. And it is worth lingering on that year, softly, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your palm before you set it down and let your hand go slack. The year was 1206. Picture a great assembly on the grasslands, a Kurultai, the word the Mongols used for the coming together of the clans, the riding in of chiefs and captains and their households until the plain was thick with tents and horses and smoke. And in the middle of that gathering, a man who had been called Temujin was raised up and given a new name. Genghis Khan, the fierce ruler, the universal ruler, the one whose word would run over all the felt-walled tents under heaven. You may have heard that name 1,000 times. Let it be small and quiet tonight. Let it be just a man on the grass being lifted into a title. Because the thing he did next is the thing that matters to you. Lying here in your tent, he looked at the old world, the world of tribes, the world where a man was a Kerit or a Naiman or a Taikyud, where your blood decided your friends and your enemies before you were old enough to speak, and he took that world apart. Gently is the wrong word, but deliberately, completely, he dissolved the old clans as fighting bodies. He broke the tribes into pieces and resorted the pieces. He took men who had grown up hating one another, men whose fathers had raided one another's herds, and he set them down together, shoulder to shoulder, in the same arban of 10, on purpose, so that the loyalty which had once flowed sideways to the tribe, to the blood, to the old chief, would now flow one way only, up to the unit, and through the unit, to him. Think about how strange that must have felt. For 100 generations your ancestors had known exactly who they were by knowing whose they were. And then, in the space of a single gathering on the grass, that thread was cut, and a new one tied in its place. You were not a tribesman any longer. You were a member of a 10. The men beside you were not chosen by blood. They were chosen by the Khan's arithmetic, and now they were closer to you than blood, because your lives were quite literally bound together. That is the part it is easy to say lightly and hard to truly feel. The 10 were not simply neighbours who happened to be counted together. They were responsible for one another, in a way that reached all the way down to life and death. If one man of your 10 fled from a battle, and the other 9 did not turn and stop him, the punishment could fall on all 10. If some of your 10 were carried off by an enemy, the rest of you were bound to try to bring them back. You did not get to be brave alone, and you did not get to be a coward alone either. Your courage and your fear were held in common, shared out among the 10 of you the way the milk and the meat were shared out, so that no man could quietly slip away from the whole and leave the others to their fate. Rest in that for a moment, because there is something almost tender inside the hardness of it. You were never, in this new world, entirely alone. There were always 9 others whose lives were laced through your own. You rode together. You camped together. You would, if it came to it, die together or live together, but rarely anything in between. And when you lay down at night, as you are lying down now, you lay down inside a small ring of men who could not afford to let you go. So this is the life that number gave you. Not an abstract thing, a daily thing made of animals and milk and grass and the slow turning of the seasons. The animals first, because the animals were everything. The Mongols spoke of the 5 snouts, the 5 kinds of beast a herding family lived among and lived upon. The horses, of course, the horses always first, the pride and the wealth and the war power of the steppe. Then the sheep, patient and plentiful, giving wool and meat and skins. The goats, hardier still, picking their way over ground the sheep would leave bare. The cattle, heavier and slower, and the camels, the great shaggy 2-humped camels of the cold high plains, carrying the tents and the carts when the whole camp picked itself up and moved. 5 kinds of breath steaming in the morning cold. 5 kinds of hoof on the frost. You did not own land, not the way a farmer far to the south owned his field. You owned animals, and the animals owned the grass, and you followed them from pasture to pasture as the year turned, and that following was your whole map of the world. And from those animals came the food that is probably still faintly on your tongue as you drift here. Milk, above all. Milk was the quiet miracle of the steppe, the thing that let a people with almost no grain and no gardens live rich and strong on the open plain. You drank it fresh and you drank it soured. You churned the mare's milk in a skin, day after day, until it turned into that pale, tart, faintly fizzing drink, the airag, the kumis, that loosens the shoulders and warms the belly and sends a tired herder softly towards sleep. And what you could not drink before it spoiled, you saved by drying it. You pressed the curds and set them out in the sun on the roof of the tent until they went hard as little stones, the arul, the dried curd that could travel for weeks in a saddlebag and keep a rider alive across a distance no bread could ever cross. Milk fresh, milk soured, milk dried into stone. A whole cuisine spun out of the patience of animals. Meat came too, of course, but meat was often for the colder months and the harder times. It was the milk in its many shapes that carried you through the ordinary days. Feel how gentle that rhythm is. The milking in the grey of the morning. The animals moving out to graze. The long, slow, sunlit hours of watching and mending and waiting. The animals coming back. The milking again in the dusk. The fire. The curds drying on the roof. The soured milk in the skin. It is a life with very little that is sudden in it. A life measured out in the breath of beasts and the length of the light, and it is easy, lying here, to let your own breath fall into that same unhurried measure. In and out. Slow as a herd settling for the night. But here is the turn, the thing you must hold alongside all that gentleness, because it is the strangest truth of the herder's rung, and the whole reason the empire could rise from grass like this. You were not only a herder, you were also, whenever the Khan's word came for you, a soldier. There was no other army. There was no separate class of paid fighting men kept somewhere apart, drilling while the herders herded. The army was the herders. The army was you. When the summons came, the same hands that had drawn the milk into the pail would string the bow and gather the horses, and the 10 who shared your fires would become the 10 who rode into war beside you, the very same faces, the very same men whose lives were already knotted to yours. You brought your own mounts. You brought your own bow, your own gear, your own dried curd knotted into a bag against your saddle. The camp did not arm you and feed you the way a distant king armed and fed his hired men. You armed and fed yourself out of your own herds, because you were already, always, half a soldier and the other half only sleeping. And when it was over, when the fighting was done, you would ride home to the same grass and the same animals and the same slow milking in the morning, and put the bow back within reach of the fire, and be a herder again until the next time the counting called your 10 to arms. Think of what that meant for the shape of a man's whole life. There was no clean line in you between the peaceful and the deadly, no wall between the tender work of raising animals and the hard work of war. They lived in the same body, in the same hands, in the same 10. A people who could turn from milking to riding to battle almost, without seeming to change their posture, and then turn back again, and lie down at night among their beasts as though nothing had happened. It is one of the quietest and most unsettling facts about the world you have climbed into. The soldier and the shepherd were the same person. And that person, tonight, is you. So stay here a little longer still on this second rung before we ever think of the rungs above. Feel the weight of belonging to a 10, the closeness of it, the danger of it, the strange comfort of 9 lives braided through your own. Taste the dried curd and the soured milk. Hear the 5 kinds of animal breathing in the dark around the camp. Know that within you, sleeping as lightly as you are, is a rider who could be called to war by a single word carried across the grass. But the word has not come. Not tonight. Tonight there is only the low fire and the settled herds, and the long, patient arithmetic of the 10s spreading out across the steppe in every direction, holding you and holding the whole quiet world softly in its count. And now the ladder opens above you, because the 10 was never the whole of it. The 10 was only the first rung, the closest count, the warmest number. Above you, if you lifted your eyes from the fire and looked out across the steppe in the dark, was a structure so clean and so complete that most of the kingdoms of the world at that time would have had no name for what it was. It was not simply an army. It was not simply a census. It was not simply a tax roll or a map of obligations. It was all of those things at once, threaded into one, expressed in the single grammar of base 10, the most ancient and reliable arithmetic the human hand knows, because it is, quite simply, the number of fingers on 2 hands. 10 arbans made a jaghun. Say that word quietly. Jaghun. 100 men, which meant 100 households, 100 fires at night, 100 women grinding grain or stretching felt, 100 strings of horses grazing at the perimeter. The jaghun had a commander of its own, a jaghunai noyan, a captain of 100, and beneath him the 10 squad leaders of the arbans, each responsible for his 9. The 100 was large enough to feel like a community, small enough that the commander could know every man's face, the name of every man's eldest son, the quality of every man's remount string. 10 jaghuns, 10 hundreds, made a minghan, 1,000. This was the formation that a campaign could bend, and a governor could administer, and a tax collector could count. The minghan was the empire's working brick. When chroniclers and administrators described how many men this valley contributed, or how many that province owed, they thought in minghans, as naturally as we might think in hundreds. And above the minghan, 10 of them together, rose the tumen, 10,000. The word meant, literally, the number 10,000. The word for the thing and the size of the thing being one and the same, as though the founders of this system wanted no ambiguity at all. A tumen was a great wing, a dark tide on the horizon, a formation that could split and swallow a battlefield. Several tumens together were what Europe saw coming across the Carpathians and called the Tartar horde. But the horde was never chaos. It was arithmetic. It was always, at its heart, a very clean piece of arithmetic. Arban, jaghun, minghan, tumen, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Let those numbers settle softly. They are not violent numbers tonight. They are the numbers of belonging, the columns in a vast, patient ledger that recorded where every person stood and what every person owed and what every person could be called to do. The ledger is what you live inside, on this third rung of the world you have climbed into. And the first thing to understand about it, the thing that will stay with you long after the details have blurred and sleep has taken the edges off the night, is that it was not only a military structure. It was everything. It was the whole shape of organized life on the steppe, compressed into 4 numbers. The same decimal unit that called your arban to battle was the unit that determined how much dried meat your household owed in tribute, how many horses your jaghun was expected to supply to the yam, the great relay post network you will learn about later, and how many men your minghan would send to guard a caravan road in the west. When the census takers came, and they came regularly and seriously in what the sources describe as a counting of the people, a formal enumeration that was not a casual exercise, but a deliberate act of imperial administration, they were not simply tallying heads. They were updating the ledger, reassigning households to units, calibrating the count against the actual number of bodies available. The decimal system was not a metaphor for organization. It was organization, the substance of it, and the Mongol state took the accuracy of its numbers seriously in a way that few administrations of that era could match. Think of what it meant to be counted in this way. In much of the medieval world, to be a common person was to be largely invisible to the state, known by your lord, if you had one, known by your priest or your headman, but not recorded in any system that stretched beyond the next valley. You were a name on a local tongue, not a number in a continental book. Under the Mongol arrangement, every herder, every arat on the open steppe had a place in a system that ran from the 10 he slept beside to the 10,000 his 1,000 was part of, and from that 10,000 all the way up to the Great Khan's own count of the whole. It was, in its way, a strange kind of dignity, the dignity of being legible, of being known not just to your neighbours, but to the state itself, in the only language the state spoke, number. And the state read that language constantly. Commanders were held to their count. If your arban of 10 was down to 7 because of desertion or sickness, or a rider who had simply ridden off into the night, that absence registered not just as a personal failing, but as a discrepancy in the ledger, a hole in the structure, a thing that would be noticed and would need explaining. The empire was, in this sense, an empire of accountants as much as an empire of warriors. The great administrators who kept the decimal rolls, many of them in the later period, drawn from the captured. Literate populations of China and Persia, scribes absorbed from the civilizations the Mongols had overrun, were as essential to the whole as any archer on a hill. The numbers were the empire. Take away the numbers, and you had only a crowd of horsemen on a very large plain. Now let the ladder carry you a little higher, and as it does, consider who stood at the top of each of its rungs. Because here the Mongol system makes a turn that is easy to overlook and important not to miss. The commanders of the arbans, the jaghuns, the mingghans, and the tumens were not, as a rule, men of old noble blood holding positions their grandfathers had held. The old tribal aristocracy, the men who had ruled the steppe clans before Genghis Khan dissolved the tribes in 1206, had been deliberately broken. Their power came from their lineages and their clan networks, and those networks had been cut. What replaced them in the decimal system was something more like promoted competence. A man who could hold his 10 together, who could read a terrain and keep his horses fit and command the trust of his 9, might be given 100. A man who could command 100 steadily and be trusted by his captain might be given 1,000. The exact criteria were not written down in any surviving document in the way a modern military promotion board might record them, but the principle is visible in the appointments Genghis Khan himself made, again and again. The commanders of his mingghans and tumens were men who had proven themselves to him through loyalty and through action, not men who arrived already wearing the rank of their fathers. There is a particular kind of openness to that arrangement, a quality almost rare enough that it seems worth pausing over. Even gently, even in the middle of this calm night. The steppe had its hierarchies, certainly. The Khan's own family, the ruling Borjigin clan, would always occupy a special place, and no ordinary herder was going to wake up one morning as a tumen commander simply by being competent. The ladder was not infinitely open. But compared to the world outside the steppe, where a European serf was a serf by birth, and a European lord was a lord by birth, and almost nothing short of a crusade, or a particularly dramatic act of God, moved a man from one condition to the other, the Mongol decimal system allowed for a degree of vertical motion that was, for its time and context, genuinely unusual. A man of no family, a man whose tribe had been crushed and absorbed, a man who had come into the system with nothing but his horses and his steadiness, could climb, not without limit, not without the favour of those above him. But the climbing was possible, and it happened, and the system knew it was possible and built it in, because an army that promoted competence won battles, and the empire was built on winning battles. You belong, then, to this ladder. You sit in your 10, and your 10 sits in its 100, and its 100 sits inside 1,000, and the 1,000 is 1/10 of a dark wing of 10,000. You know your place, not in the way a prisoner knows a cell, but in the way a musician knows a chord, as a part of something larger that only makes sense when all its parts are present. Your obligation runs upward to your commander of 10, and his obligation runs upward to the commander of the 100, and that obligation climbs, rung by rung, all the way to the Khan's own tent. And the Khan's obligation runs back down. The loot from the last campaign was divided by rule, flowing downward through the chain of command, a share to the tumen commander, a share to the minghan, smaller shares descending through the jaghun to the arban, to the ordinary trooper sleeping on the same felt mat as you. You were not simply subject to this system, you were sustained by it, you were fed by it, Your remount string, your gur, your dried curd, your winter store, all of these, in the long logic of the empire, were downstream of the same decimal current that called you to arms. Rest here a moment in that current. Do not try to hold all the numbers at once. Let them come gently, one after another, the way water comes down a hillside. No urgency, no cliff's edge, just the even, unhurried flow of a very orderly world doing what orderly worlds do in the dark. Keeping count. Keeping count of the horses. Keeping count of the men. Keeping count of the tribute owed and the tribute paid, and the tribute that will come due again when the next season turns. Somewhere, in a large tent near the centre of the imperial camp, a man with a brush and an inkstone is entering your ten into a column, and the column is part of a page, and the page is part of a book, and the book is part of an empire that stretches. Right now, tonight, on the steppe where you are breathing, further than any traveller has yet walked end to end. You are in the book. You have a number, and in the world you have climbed into, having a number is not nothing. Having a number is, in its way, everything. But there was one more rung above the decimal soldier, one more thing the ladder could give to those who deserved it. And this is the rung that changes the quality of the whole story. It is the rung that answers the question you may have been carrying since the very bottom of this ladder, since the moment we stood beside the defeated people being sorted from the ruins of their city, since we watched the captured smith put down his tools and wait to learn what kind of life would now be given to him. It is the rung called Darkhan. The word itself, Darkhan, carried weight on the steppe in a way that is difficult to translate into a single clean English equivalent. It meant, in its fullest sense, a person of exemption, a person of privilege, not by birth, not by family, not by the old tribal ranking that the 1206 reforms had deliberately swept aside, but by recognition. By the deliberate choice of those above to say, this one has earned something more than the ordinary lot. This one stands a little apart from the common obligations. This one is marked. The marking could come from two directions, and it is worth holding both of them in mind because they speak to something important about what the Mongol system valued and what it was willing to reward. The first direction was skill, a master craftsman, a smith who could work iron into a shape that held under stress, a bowyer whose composite bows did not split in the cold, a builder who understood how to construct a siege machine from timber and rope, and the physics of stored tension was not only useful to the empire. He was irreplaceable in the way that ordinary soldiers were not. An empire could find 10,000 more cavalry riders without particular difficulty. It could not easily find another man who knew how to construct a counterweight trebuchet, or who had spent 20 years learning the exact chemistry of hardening steel. These men, when captured, were sorted out of the doomed mass and kept. But keeping them was only the beginning. The empire also needed to hold them, to give them a reason to stay and work, and not simply sit in resentful silence beside a fire that was not their own. Darkhan status, the formal exemption from certain obligations, the lightening of the burden, the recognition of value, was one of the instruments by which the Mongol system converted a reluctant captive into a productive member of the imperial apparatus. The second direction was loyalty and valour. A man who had saved the Khan's life in battle, or who had performed some signal act of courage or faithfulness at a moment when it mattered enormously, could also be elevated to Darkhan status. The secret history of the Mongols, the great interior chronicle of the early empire, composed roughly around the middle of the 13th century, a text that blends chronicle and epic in a way that makes exact quotation difficult, but makes its emotional texture vivid and irreplaceable. Records the granting of these privileges to faithful followers in terms that are, even across the centuries and the translation, unmistakably warm. To be told that your faults would be forgiven up to 9 times, 9 being a number of great significance on the steppe, a number of abundance and completion, was to be told something profound about your standing in the new world. It was to be told that the Khan had chosen to carry you, to absorb a measure of your human imperfection as the price of keeping your loyalty and your service close. It was, in the language of the steppe, as close as a ruler could come to saying, "You are not simply a number in my ledger. You are a name I have decided to protect." The Darkhan privilege could pass through a man's descendants. Some accounts suggest the exemption was heritable for 9 generations, that same resonant 9, which meant that a single act of valor or a single demonstration of irreplaceable skill could lift not only a man but his children and his grandchildren, and the grandchildren of his grandchildren, out of the common lot, out of the ordinary arithmetic of tribute and obligation, into a slightly easier, slightly lighter position in the world. 9 generations is a very long time. It is, by most measures, somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 centuries. The shadow of one man's excellence falling forward across 9 generations of his blood is a kind of immortality the steppe could offer to those it chose to honor. Now hold this for a moment and feel what it means for the shape of the whole structure you have been climbing. At the bottom, the bowl, the captive, the unfree dependent, the person who had no choice in any of this, and whose life was entirely in the hands of the household that now held him. Above that, the arat, the common herder, counted in his 10, and bound by collective liability to the 9 beside him. And above the arat, accessed not by birth, but by what you could do, or what you had done, the Darkhan. The exempt one, the recognized one, the one the empire had decided was worth more than the ordinary rate. There is something quietly remarkable about that gradient when you trace it from one end to the other. The man at the bottom had nothing, no family here, no language that the people around him necessarily spoke, no possessions beyond what he had been allowed to keep, no future that anyone had promised him. The man at the top of this particular band, the Darkhan, the one marked out, had been given a formal reprieve from the weight of ordinary life, a lightening of the burden that most people carried without question for their entire existence. And what separated the bottom from the top was not bloodline. It was what you carried inside your hands and your head and your character. The smith's knowledge of iron, the engineer's understanding of stress and load, the soldier's instinct in a difficult moment to step between the danger and the man above him. These were things you brought with you. These were things no amount of conquest could take away, because they lived not in your property or your city or your tribe, all of which could be destroyed in an afternoon, but in you. This is perhaps the strangest comfort the Mongol world had to offer, and it is a comfort that sits oddly with the violence of how people arrived in that world. It does not redeem the violence, nothing retroactively redeems the violence, but it complicates the picture, which is what the truth almost always does when you look at it steadily enough. The empire that killed and displaced so many people also built a system in which the value of a person was not simply their obedience or their expendability, but their specific, irreplaceable usefulness. And that system, for the useful, for the skilled, for the loyal and the brave, offered something that many of the more settled, more traditionally aristocratic societies of the same era did not: a real path upward, marked on the ledger in ink, recognized by a word, Darkhan, that carried force wherever Mongol authority reached. The captured smith who had put down his tools beside a burning city and waited, he could, given time and given fortune, and given the quality of the work that came from his hands, arrive here. He could become the exempt one, the recognized one. The man whose name was not just a number in a column, but a note in the margin of the imperial record that said, "This one is different. This one we keep. This one we protect, within limits, because what lives in this one's hands is worth more to us than the satisfaction of treating him like everyone else." Let that thought settle very slowly, the way a heavy thing settles to the bottom of still water, without drama, without a splash, just the slow, inevitable descent to where it rests. The empire that measured everything in numbers had a category reserved for the people who could not be reduced to a number. The artisan, the scribe, the doctor, the engineer, the soldier who stepped forward at the crucial moment, the Darkhan, the one the number could not fully contain. And if you are lying here tonight in the posture of a person who carries something particular inside them, a skill, a knowledge, a habit of faithfulness, a way of doing a specific thing that not everyone can do, then perhaps this rung of the ladder speaks to you in a way the earlier ones did not. Not because the Mongol Empire was kind, or just, or anything you would choose, but because inside a world that classified and sorted and numbered every living person, it had the practical wisdom to know that some people defied clean classification, and it made a word for them. And the word was Darkhan, and the word carried weight across a continent for as long as the empire that coined it lasted. Be very still for a moment on this rung. There is no urgency. The ladder is not going anywhere. You have climbed from the bottom, from the fire at the edge of the defeated city, from the redistribution of the defeated, from the careful sorting of the skilled from the doomed, up through the 10, the 100, the 1,000, the 10,000, and now to this small, quiet landing where the exempt ones rest. You have not yet reached the levels where the great machinery of trade and law and power operates at its fullest extension. You have not yet walked the relay roads or held a metal tablet in your hand that opens every gate on the continent, or sat beneath the spreading shelter of the law that was said to bind even the Khan himself, or stood at the edge of the great assembly where the ruler of the world was chosen by acclamation from the gathered princes. All of that is still ahead, still climbing, still waiting in the upper reaches of this long, gentle ladder. But for now you are here, on the third rung, in the space between the ordinary and the honoured, between the number and the name. The felt of your gear is soft against the dark. Somewhere in the camp, in the quietest hour, a fire burns low, and a man with iron-stained hands turns a piece of metal in the light, working it the way only he knows how to work it, the knowledge sitting in his fingers like something inherited from the earth itself. He does not know yet what his life will become. He does not know yet what word will one day attach itself to him. But the work is good, and the work is visible, and somewhere in the long arithmetic of the empire, someone is watching, and counting, and making a note. That is enough for now. That is tonight, more than enough. Let the counting go on without your attention. Let the 10 and the 100 and the 1,000 and the 10,000 do their patient work in the dark beyond your awareness. Let the lamp of the Darkhan's status glow softly at the edge of your imagining, not as a destination you must reach, not as a pressure or a demand, but simply as a door that exists in the wall of this world. A door you did not know was there until you climbed high enough to see it. The night is deep, and the steppe is wide, and the empire is enormous beyond any one person's capacity to hold it all in mind at once. But you have climbed 2 rungs, and then 3, and the next rungs are waiting, and there is no hurry, and the voice carrying you upward through all of this is in no rush to get to the top, because the point was never the top. The point was always the climbing itself and the slow accumulation of the world you have been walking through, one rung at a time, in the long and patient dark. And so we climb. The decimal ladder of the Mongol Empire was not, in the end, a military invention. It was a social one. That distinction matters more than it might seem in the quietness of this hour. Armies have always organized themselves into squads and battalions and wings. What Genghis Khan did at the Great Kurultai of 1206 was something stranger and more permanent. He took the whole of the steppe and sorted it. Not by blood, not by the old tribe whose name a man had carried since birth, whose chief his father had served, and whose pastures his grandfather had died defending. He dissolved all of that. He drew a line through the inherited world and replaced it with a number. 10 men became an arban. That was the first rung of the new arithmetic, the one closest to the ground, the one you felt against your ribs every morning when you woke and looked at the 9 men sleeping beside you. Those 9 were not necessarily your cousins or your childhood companions. They might have been strangers a season ago, drawn from different clans, different valleys, different histories, assembled not by accident of birth, but by deliberate imperial design. Because a man who fights beside his brother will follow his brother off the field, and a man who fights beside a stranger has nowhere to go but forward. The 10 were a unit of mutual creation. You made each other, over time, into something resembling trust. 10 arbans made a jaghun of 100. 10 jaghuns made a minghan of 1,000. 10 mingghans made a tumen of 10,000. The structure was clean enough to hold in one breath, logical enough that a child could understand its shape, and vast enough that its furthest edges disappeared over any horizon you could name. And it did not merely organize soldiers. That is the thing the ladder asks you to understand. The same decimal frame that counted fighting men also counted households, assessed tribute, organized the labor of supplying the relay stations, and kept the census of the empire's human inventory. There was no separate bureaucratic system running quietly behind the military one. They were the same system. One architecture of counting, doing every task at once, army and census and tax register and administrative grid, all collapsed into the same set of numbers, the same tiers of command, the same chain of named men holding the rope at every level. A commander of 1,000, a minghan commander, was appointed by the Khan himself. And here is the thing about that appointment, the thing that made the empire feel different from the inside than most of the world's great states had felt before. The man who received it did not have to be nobly born. He had to be competent. The decimal structure was merit-shaped in a way that most medieval hierarchies were not. And the history of the Mongol expansion is partly the history of humble men handed 10,000 soldiers because they had proved at the level of 10 and then 100 and then 1,000 that they knew what they were doing. Birth mattered. Proximity to the Khan mattered. Loyalty mattered above almost anything. But a man could rise through the counted rungs without the accident of noble blood behind him, and that possibility, however narrow in practice, was written into the architecture of the thing. The tumen was the great formation, the 10,000, the number a general moved across a steppe like a single animal. Campaigns were spoken of in tumens, the way later armies would be spoken of in divisions. A few tumens together could darken a horizon. The counts on paper were rarely exact, units shrank in campaign and swelled with new conscripts, and the mathematics of war does not wait for tidy arithmetic, but the commanders were held to their numbers, and the counting itself was taken seriously enough to require periodic census. The phrase used in the sources is something like the counting of the people, not the mustering of soldiers, the counting of people. Because in the empire of the ladder, the two things were the same thing. Let the counting go on around you now. Let the 10 and the 100 and the 1,000 arrange themselves at the edges of your awareness without requiring anything from you. The structure does not need your attention to stand. And it is within this structure, precisely here, at the seam between the counted and the exceptional, that the Darkhan enters the story. The word itself is old and carries a kind of weight that the English language takes several sentences to approximate. A Darkhan was someone exempted, someone freed, someone whose ordinary obligations, the taxes, the duties, the liability of the counted rung, had been lifted away and replaced with something rarer, the status of a person whose usefulness was recognized at a level above accounting. The Darkhan did not simply belong to the ladder. The ladder acknowledged that something about this person fell outside its ordinary categories. The secret history of the Mongols, the great insider chronicle of the empire, written in the mid-13th century, speaks of loyal followers granted privileges of this kind, their faults to be forgiven, the record says, up to 9 times. 9 is a sacred number on the steppe, a number of completeness and grace. To be granted forgiveness 9 times over was to be held, in some sense, above the ordinary consequences that governed everyone beneath you. And that forgiveness, in some cases, passed downward through 9 generations. The exemption was not yours alone. It was an inheritance, a thread of elevation woven into your family's future. This is where the captive with a skill could finally arrive. Not immediately, not easily, but the door existed. The man with iron-stained hands, sitting in the war camp firelight, working the metal the way only he knew how, if the work was good enough, if it reached the right eyes, if the ladder's cold arithmetic recognized the warmth of what he made, the status of the Darkhan was one of the places the long climb could end. Not in freedom, exactly. The steppe did not offer freedom in any simple sense, but in something that from the bottom of the ladder must have seemed nearly as extraordinary. Recognition of that kind was not easy to come by, and most men on the ladder never reached it. Most men climbed only as far as the level above the common herder, and that level, if it brought authority at all, brought it through service, through loyalty, through the long demonstration of something the empire valued more than blood. We have moved through the lowest rungs now. We have sat in the war campfire and counted the cost of capture. We have walked with the arat through his seasonal pastures, known the weight of his remount string, felt the cold press of the arbans' mutual liability. We have visited the Darkhan in his exempted life, watched the smith's hands cool and go still at last. Now we climb. The next rung is the rung of command. The Noyan was the lord, the officer, the man to whom the minghan and the tumen answered. The word itself simply means commander, lord, But in the Mongol world it carried a particular weight because the noyans of Genghis Khan's empire were not, for the most part, the inheritors of old tribal thrones. They were, many of them, his nka, his sworn companions, men who had bound themselves to Temujin before the empire existed, when binding yourself to him was a gamble with your life rather than a safe bet on the winning side. The word nka is worth pausing on. It means companion, associate, a man who rides with you. In the steppe world before the great reorganization, an nka was a man who had left his own tribe or clan and attached himself personally to a chief, not because of kinship, not because the rules of birth required it, but by choice. A voluntary bond, an act of faith and calculation made in the same breath. To become Temujin's nka in the years before 1206. In the years when he was still fighting to hold the steppe together against rivals who wanted him dead, was to stake everything on the wager that this particular man would prevail. Some who made that wager did not survive to see it paid out, but those who did, those who had ridden with him through the bitter early campaigns, who had shared the hunger and the cold and the precarious nights before victory was certain, those men rose with him. Their sworn companionship became the foundation of the new ruling class. This is one of the quietly astonishing things about the empire's upper structure. The noyans, who commanded its armies and governed its territories, were not simply the old aristocracy wearing new clothes. Some of them were men of obscure origin who had made the right choice at the right moment. Loyalty, demonstrated early and held under pressure, was a currency the empire spent and honoured. The decimal ladder had opened a path from the arban upward, and the noyans were the proof that the path was real. But the noyan's life was not simply the life of an honoured companion at a comfortable distance from the fighting. Command in the Mongol system was intimate with risk and intimate with the machinery of discipline and reward that held the whole structure in motion. And the most important mechanism of that reward, the thing that made a noyan's loyalty worth more than mere sentiment, was the systematic division of what was taken. Plunder. The word has a chaotic sound. It suggests riot, the breaking of lines, soldiers scattering to grab what they could before order reimposed itself. But in the Mongol Empire, plunder was not chaos. It was a managed process, as carefully structured as the decimal ladder itself, and it was the economic engine that made loyalty rational. When a campaign concluded and a city or a tribe's herds were taken, the wealth did not simply disperse into the hands of whoever had been closest to it. The loot was collected, it was gathered by the officers and sorted, and then it was divided according to a system of fixed shares. The ordinary trooper, the man in the arban, the cavalryman who had ridden through the cold and fought on command, received his portion. It was a real portion, a guaranteed cut, something he could count on receiving if he obeyed orders and survived. The commanders above him received larger portions, scaling with rank. And at the very summit of the division, a share was held back for the Khan. The precise fraction reserved for the Khan varied and is described differently across the sources. But the principle was consistent, and the sources agree on its existence. A portion of every campaign's yield flowed upward, acknowledged as the Khan's by right and by custom. Think of it as something like a tithe running in reverse, not upward to heaven, but upward to the counted apex of the human ladder. The Khan was not merely the commander of the armies. He was, in a concrete economic sense, the empire's primary shareholder, drawing a real return from every successful act of force his forces performed. And the system worked, in no small part, because it was predictable. You knew before the campaign began that if you obeyed the orders and the battle was won, you would receive your share. You did not need to scramble for it. You did not need to cheat. The discipline was sustained partly by fear, but also by the rational calculation that following the rules paid better than breaking them. A soldier who broke ranks to grab loot early, before the officers had organized the collection, was not simply undisciplined. He was stealing from the system that guaranteed everyone else's portion, including his own future portions. The penalty for it, accordingly, was severe. This is one of those details that tends to surprise people who think of Mongol armies as organized chaos. The prohibition on breaking ranks to plunder mid-battle was a genuine rule enforced with real consequences for the men who violated it. You did not run toward the fallen city while the fighting was still happening. You did not strip the bodies before the signal came. You held your position. You finished the work of the campaign. And then, only then, the division of what was taken could begin. Greed was real on the steppe, as it is everywhere. But the Mongol system did something unusual. It harnessed greed to discipline, rather than letting greed dissolve discipline. The loot share was the carrot that made the whip less necessary. A Noyan's reward was not only in plunder, though the campaigns could be enormously lucrative for the men who led them. A Noyan might also receive an appanage, a grant of territory, of people, of pasture land. In the pastoral economy of the steppe, wealth was not primarily measured in coins or in acres of field. It was measured in people and in animals. An appanage meant herds assigned to you, pastures for those herds to range across, and human beings, sometimes entire communities of conquered people, bound to work for and feed the household of the Noyan who had been granted them. Rank converted into this very concrete form. The minghan commander received his 1,000 men and their families as an administrative unit. But the great Noyan, the tumen commander, might receive something that looked, from a certain distance, almost like a small kingdom. People and pastures, the two great currencies of the steppe world, flowing to the men who had served well. It is worth pausing here and noticing something about this system. The Noyan's power was real, but it was delegated. It came from above, it had been given, and in principle it could be taken back. The old tribal chiefs had held their authority because it was theirs by descent, recognized by custom that stretched back before memory. The Noyan held his authority because the Khan had assigned it. This is the difference the decimal reorganization made at the upper end of the ladder as much as at the lower. The Noyans commanded more than any tribal chief had commanded. But they commanded because the counting machine pointed to them, and the counting machine answered to one man at its apex. We are climbing. The air changes as we go higher. Above the Noyans, very close to the summit now, closer than any man without blood relation to the Khan could ordinarily reach, there was a core of men who lived, worked, and slept in the immediate physical presence of the ruler himself. They were the Keshig. And to understand the Keshig is to understand something important about how the empire's center held together, how authority was transmitted, and how the next generation of command was made. The Keshig was the imperial guard. In its mature form, under Genghis Khan, it grew to something like 10,000 men, a full tumen, an elite corps whose head count matched the greatest operational formation in the army, but whose function was entirely different. A tumen in the field was a hammer, a mass of cavalry directed at an enemy. The Keshig was something more intricate and, in the long run, more consequential. It was the household of power itself. The word keshig relates to the notion of a shift, a turn of duty, and the organization of the guard reflected this from the beginning. The keshig served in rotation. There were day guards and night guards, each with their own designated duties and their own hierarchy within the corps. The day guard watched over the approaches to the Khan's tents, managed the flow of visitors and petitioners, kept order in the vast moving city of the Ordo. The night guard took over when the day closed, and they held the most sensitive post of all, the space immediately around the sleeping Khan himself. To stand watch over a sleeping ruler is, when you think about it carefully, to hold extraordinary power in trust. The night watch position was the most intimate military role the empire offered, intimate with vulnerability, intimate with the weight of what could go wrong if the trust was violated. Deserting a night watch post was not merely a disciplinary failure. It was treated as a matter close to treason, with a lethality to match. The men who guarded the Khan while he slept were held to an accountability that reflected how seriously the institution took its own function. They were not decorative. They were a last and final layer of the empire's architecture, the seal over everything that had been built. But the keshig was far more than a set of guards around a sleeping man. It was the empire's administrative corps and its officer nursery in a single institution. The guardsmen did not simply stand with weapons at tent poles. They managed the Khan's world in its daily operational detail: the tents, the equipment, the horses, the food stores, the weapons, the documents, the material substance of imperial power as it existed in physical things. A guardsman might be responsible for the Khan's quivers one season and for the management of tribute deliveries the next. The keshig was, in modern terms, something like the combination of a head of household's personal staff, a treasury office, and a military academy, all organized inside the single institution of personal service to the ruler. This last function, the academy function, was perhaps the most important of the three for the empire's longevity. Because the keshig was not recruited solely from the ranks of the willing or the capable. The sons of Noyans, the sons of Minghan commanders, the sons of the men who led the great decimal formations, were required to serve in it, not invited. Required, they came to the keshig as something that had a double nature, part honor, part hostage. The father who commanded 1,000 men in the field knew that his sons served in the immediate presence of the Khan. That knowledge worked on the father. It kept the loyalty of the corps tethered to the loyalty of the commanders who answered to the corps' master. And while the sons served, they learned. They watched how the empire was managed from its center. They understood the mechanics of tribute, of dispatch, of the management of a mobile court that was simultaneously the seat of supreme power and a moving camp crossing hundreds of miles of steppe. The keshig was the school where the next generation of the empire's leadership was formed, and it was a school whose curriculum was entirely practical, not texts, not philosophy, but the daily lived operation of the world's largest state. There is a detail about the keshig's internal hierarchy that illuminates the whole system's priorities. A man who served in the keshig, even at a relatively junior rank within the guard, held precedence in the field over an ordinary commander of a minghan, a man who commanded 1,000. Think about what that means. The guardsman, the man in personal service to the Khan, outranked the field officer who led 1,000 fighting men. The proximity to the center carried more weight than the management of a large formation at the periphery. The empire's gravitational center was real and felt. It pulled rank toward itself. Let your breathing slow a little now. Feel the weight of the night around you. Imagine what it meant to stand the night watch in the Keshig. The steppe outside the tent, walls dark, the wind moving across the grass in long, slow waves you could hear but not see. Inside, the quiet of a sleeping encampment, the soft sounds of animals, the distant call of another guard changing position somewhere in the dark perimeter. And at the center of it all, the tent of the great Khan, where the most powerful man in the known world lay sleeping, and where you stood because the institution had placed you there, because your duty was precisely this, to be awake while he was not. There is something worth carrying forward in that image, the guard who holds the center of the counting machine together, not through conquest or through loot, but through the simple, grave act of staying awake when it matters. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Learning came easier, energy became real, and the mind stayed sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. And we continue now. Below the Keshig in terms of daily proximity to the Khan, but touching every rung of the ladder in terms of practical consequence. The network that tied the vast distances of the empire into something a single command could actually control. We have looked inward at the hierarchy of men and duties clustered around the center. Now we look outward at the structure that allowed the center's will to move. The yam. Every empire that spans a continent faces the same fundamental problem. It is not the problem of conquest, though conquest is hard enough. It is the problem of communication. How does a command issued at one edge of a vast territory reach the other edge before the situation that prompted it has changed beyond recognition? How does the ruler know what is happening at the frontier before the frontier has already resolved itself, one way or another, without his input? Distance is not just a geographic fact. It is a political one. The larger the territory, the more the center's authority dissolves as the order travels, diluted by time and the exhaustion of messengers and the degradation of every horse that runs too long without rest. The Mongol answer to this problem was the yam, and it was not a new idea in the sense of having been invented from nothing. But it was deployed at a scale and with a rigor that made it effectively new in the way it worked. The yam was a relay system, a chain of post stations, each one positioned roughly a day's ride from the last, something in the range of 30 to 40 kilometers, perhaps around 25 miles, running outward from the imperial center across the whole of the empire's territory. Every station was stocked. Fresh horses waited there, food and shelter were available, and the keeper of the station, the household or community whose obligation it was to maintain it, ensured that a rider arriving exhausted from the previous stage could hand off his message and be replaced by a fresh courier on a fresh horse, continuing onward without pause. Picture what this means in practical terms. A message leaves the Khan's ordo. A rider takes it and covers the first 30 or 40 kilometers to the first station. He hands it to the next rider, who covers the next 30 or 40 kilometers. And so it goes, station by station, rider by rider, none of them traveling more than their designated stage, but each of them traveling it fast on a fresh mount. The message moves at the speed of the horse, not a single horse ridden to exhaustion over hundreds of miles, but horse after horse after horse, each one rested, each one ready, each one covering its own short, rapid span. The distances that urgent messages could cover in a single day under this system were extraordinary. Sources from both the Persian and Chinese traditions describe figures well above 200 kilometers, better than 125 miles as the reach of the fastest dispatches. This was not routine speed, it was emergency speed, the capability of the system at its most urgent. But even at moderate urgency, the Yam moved information at a pace that no rival government of the age could match. A command issued in the Mongol heartland could reach a distant campaign army in days rather than months. Intelligence could travel back almost as quickly. What made the physical system work was not only the fresh horses. It was the authorization device that commanded the system to function, the paisa, also called the jerij, the small tablet carried by those authorized to use the relay network. The paisa was, in its physical form, a tablet, usually of metal, sometimes of wood, engraved with the authority of the Khan and the rank of the bearer. And its material told you everything you needed to know about the bearer's status. A gold or gilt paisa commanded the highest deference, every gate opened, every stable produced its best horses, every official along the route bent to the requirement of the person carrying it. A silver paisa carried lesser authority but still commanded the network's resources. A wooden paisa was the lowest grade, sufficient for ordinary official business, but marking the bearer as a less consequential figure in the imperial machinery. Marco Polo, who travelled through the empire's network in the latter part of the 13th century, described the paisa and the yam system with the wondering precision of someone who had genuinely encountered something he had no framework to compare it to. His account, and those of Persian chroniclers like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, agree on the essential mechanism even where they differ in detail, and when independent observers from different cultural and linguistic traditions, writing at different times and with different purposes, agree on how a system worked, it is a reasonable sign that the system really did work that way. What the paisa represented was something abstract and enormous made tangible in a palm-sized piece of metal. It was, in its way, a concentrated version of everything the empire was, authority made portable. The Khan's will encoded into an object that could travel without the Khan, speak without his voice, open doors without his presence. The man carrying the paisa was not himself necessarily powerful. He might be a courier, a tax official, an ordinary agent of the imperial administration. But the object in his hand was the empire's authority in miniature, and the network of stations and horses and keepers arrayed across the steppe existed in order to respond to it. The paisa system was graded, layered, exact, the same counting logic that sorted men into arbans and jaghuns and mingghans was here applied to the gradations of official authorization. You always knew, when you saw the paisa, exactly how much weight to give it. The gold tablet was not a suggestion, it was, in the practical vocabulary of the yam, a command that the whole network had been organized to obey. And the network was not free. Nothing in the empire was free, in the sense of existing without someone paying for it. The cost of the yam fell on the people closest to it, the arat households and settled communities in the vicinity of each station. The obligation was called the ulah, or in some sources the art, the duty of keeping the station supplied with horses, with food, with fodder, with shelter. It was a levy in labour and in animals, one of the heaviest burdens the ordinary household bore. The herder who was counted in the arban, whose horses were the foundation of his wealth and his livelihood, might find that a portion of those horses were effectively conscripted into the imperial communications network, available to be ridden by whoever arrived at the station with the right paisa. This is the thread that runs all the way back through the ladder to the very bottom. The grandeur of the yam, the astonishing speed of imperial communication, the palm-sized tablet that opened every gate, the courier covering 125 miles on horses he never owned, all of it rested, ultimately, on the herder's herd. The speed that allowed the great Khan's commands to cross a continent was paid for in the horses of men who would never see the Khan, who lived their entire lives inside their arban of 10, who would never know what message had just passed through their station and where it was going. This is the nature of large systems. The magnificence at the centre is produced by obligations extracted from the edges. The yam was genuinely remarkable, and it was genuinely costly to exactly the people least able to afford it, in exactly the animals they could least afford to lose. Persian and Chinese observers both recorded this burden alongside their admiration for the system's speed. Giovanni, writing in the 13th century, acknowledged the extraordinary reach of the relay network in the same breath that he noted the weight it placed on the surrounding populations. The two things were inseparable. The system's efficiency and the common person's obligation were the same fact described from different positions in the ladder. What the yam created, in aggregate, was something that had not existed before in quite this form across such a territory, a genuinely administered space. A landscape where a single will could project itself not just through force applied where the army was, but through information and logistics, sustained everywhere the network ran. The Mongol Empire at its height was not simply the largest territory under one military command. It was the largest territory inside a single communication grid, a place where the center could know and be known across distances that previously had meant silence. We have moved far now from the captive in the war camp and the herder counted into his 10. We have climbed through the exempted Darkhan, the looting Noyan with his fixed share and his appanage of people and pastures, the Kashig guardsman standing awake in the dark while the Khan slept. And now we stand at the network itself, the invisible lattice of stations and horses and metal tablets that made all the rungs of the ladder legible to the man at the top of it. The speed of the yam is in a way the physical measure of the empire's internal coherence. It tells you not just how fast messages moved, it tells you how seriously the empire took the question of whether the centre's will could actually reach its own edges, and how much it was willing to extract from ordinary households to ensure the answer stayed yes. A single order from the Khan's Ordo could reach the borders of the empire in weeks. This was not an accident or a fortunate feature of the terrain. It was a designed capability, maintained at continuous cost, enforced by the same system of obligation and accountability that organized the army and collected the tribute and exempted the Darkhan. The empire was a machine, and the yam was its nervous system, the network that allowed sensation from the periphery to reach the center and the center's responses to reach the periphery, before the world had moved too far for either to matter. And at every relay station, somewhere along that vast chain, there was a household responsible for the horses. A family who had been counted, assessed, assigned their obligation, and whose animals stood in a paddock or grazed on a nearby slope, waiting for the next rider to arrive with a tablet they might never be able to read, carrying news they would never be told, bound for a place they would never go. The paisa passed through their hands, or rather, it did not pass through their hands. It was presented, acknowledged, honoured. The fresh horse was brought forward. The rider changed mounts and was gone, the message continuing on its way across the steppe. The family returned to their paddock. That is the yam, seen from the station, and seen from the summit, from the vantage of whoever had just dispatched the rider. It was the closest thing the 13th century world had to a telegraph. An empire that could feel its own edges. We are not yet at the summit. 2 more rungs remain. There is a level above the relay station that no rider could see from the saddle. It was not a place so much as a condition, the condition of living inside an economy, of being embedded in a system of obligation that turned what you owned or produced or traded into a number on someone else's ledger. Most people living under the Mongol Empire did not think of themselves as economic actors. They thought of themselves as herders, farmers, weavers, merchants, priests. But the empire thought of them differently. It thought of them as sources. This is the 7th rung, and it is not a rung most people imagine when they imagine the Mongol world. The cavalry and the burning cities take up most of the space in that imagination. But behind the cavalry was an accountant, and behind the burning city was a tax assessor, and behind the tax assessor was a system that was, in certain ways, in certain lights, more sophisticated than what it replaced. The Mongol state ran on 2 revenues. The first was tribute and taxation from the populations it ruled. The second was the flow of trade it chose to protect. Neither was accidental. Both were deliberate choices about how to extract value from a vast, diverse, conquered world. The tax on nomadic herders was called the kubhur, a head tax levied on people and on their animals, the 5 snouts the herder counted every spring. How many horses? How many sheep? How many goats? How many cattle? How many camels? The assessors came with their counters and their ledgers, and the herder, who had been counted into an arban of 10, was now counted again, this time for what he owed. A portion of his animals, or their value in some other form, moved upward through the decimal structure. The arban's obligation fed the jaghuns' tally. The jaghuns' tally fed the mingghans' accounts. And somewhere at the top, in the great order of the Khan, the numbers resolved into horses and felt and food and silver. The tax on commerce was different. It was called the tamha, a word that also meant a seal or a stamp, the mark impressed on goods to show they had been assessed. A commercial tax levied at markets and city gates on the movement of goods through the empire's arteries. A merchant entering a city carried his wares through a gate and paid his tamha, and the city's accountants noted it, and the silver or silk or whatever he rendered moved into the empire's accounts. The tamga was applied by Mongol administrators across the settled world, in Persia, in China, in the cities of Central Asia, wherever markets operated under Mongol authority. And then there were the autok. The word autok meant something like a trading partner or a commercial associate, and it named a practice that the Mongols formalized into policy. The Mongol ruling house and its commanders invested capital, silver, goods, animals with merchant companies, who then took that capital out along the trade routes and returned with profit, which was shared. Royal money travelling with merchant caravans, the highest ranks of the empire as silent investors in the Silk Road's traffic. It was not what anyone would call a modern institution, but it was more sophisticated than the image of the burning city suggests. The empire was not simply consuming its conquests. It was, at least in part, trying to compound them. The reason it could do this was the yam, the relay network of Level 6, which had carried messages and orders, also underpinned the safety of long-distance trade. A caravan moving through the empire moved through a landscape of post stations, each one a node of imperial presence, horses, guards, officials, the implied weight of Mongol authority behind the Pisa tablet that could be presented at any point. Attacking a caravan under Mongol protection was an act of extraordinary recklessness. Bandits who had flourished in the fragmented world before the empire found the new order inhospitable. The roads grew quieter for the caravans, which meant busier for the merchants, which meant more tamga, more autok profits, more silver in the Khan's accounts. This is what historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. An uneasy name, given what it cost to establish. But as a description of a particular economic condition, it holds. For roughly a century, the Silk Road, that loose and ancient web of routes connecting China to Persia to the Mediterranean, was more integrated, more protected, and more trafficked than it had been in generations. Silk moved west. Silver moved east. Spices and horses and paper and ideas and artisans and ambassadors moved in both directions, passing through Mongol territory under the theoretical guarantee of Mongol law. Marco Polo travelled its length in the late 13th century and found the post stations, the Pisa system, the relay horses, all still functioning. He wrote about them. His account, for all its travellers' embellishments, matches in its essential mechanics what Persian and Chinese sources describe from the other direction. The silver that flowed through these routes was the empire's high-value medium. In China, the Mongol rulers experimented with something more ambitious, paper currency, backed by silver reserves held by the state. The idea was not entirely new to China, but the Mongol administration formalized it and extended it, issuing paper notes that were supposed to be exchangeable for silver and that circulated within the Chinese territories they controlled. When the backing held, the currency worked. When it did not, when more paper was issued than the silver reserves could support, the currency inflated, and the merchants who had traded in it found their profits dissolving. The experiment produced both genuine innovation and genuine suffering, sometimes in the same generation. And along those same Silk Road routes, the ones made safer by the Yam, the Pisa, the autok system, something else travelled. Something that no merchant intended to carry, and no post station could filter. The routes that accelerated the movement of silk and silver also accelerated the movement of plague. The pathogen that caused the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, travelled along the same arteries that the Pax Mongolica had opened and protected. The scholarly consensus places the mid-14th century outbreak in the context of those Mongol integrated trade networks. The same roads that brought a weaver in Persia closer to a dyer in China, that let a merchant in Samarkand invest in autok capital with a Mongol prince, also brought the pathogen westward with a speed that a fragmented pre-imperial landscape might have slowed. That is the thing about integration. It works in both directions. The benefit and the danger move on the same road. You did not need to be a merchant to feel the economy of the seventh rung. If you were a herder in the Arban, you felt the kubkur assessor. If you were a craftsman in a conquered city, you paid the tamha on what you sold at market. If you were a scribe in the imperial administration, you helped keep the ledgers that made the whole system legible. The economy was not something that happened elsewhere to other people. It was the condition in which you existed. The counting that had placed you in a 10 and 100 and 1,000 had also placed you in an account. You were a number for the census. You were a number for the tax. You were a number for the tribute. The empire had many ways of knowing your name. We climb one more rung before the summit. And this one is harder to stand on, because the ground beneath it is partly missing. The yasa, sometimes written jasa. the body of law and decree attributed to Genghis Khan, said to be the single code that bound every person in the empire, from the poorest arat herding his 5 snouts on a wind-swept slope to the Khan's own sons and grandsons in their golden tents. The principle was extraordinary. One law, above tribe and above person, enforced uniformly, applying even to the man who had made it. There is a problem. The literal text of the Yasa does not survive. No original manuscript exists, no inscription, no tablet with its clauses carved into it. What we have instead is a scattered record of provisions reported by writers who came after, sometimes decades after, sometimes a century or more, who were themselves drawing on tradition, on testimony, on documents they may or may not have seen in full. Juvaini, the Persian historian who wrote his History of the World Conqueror in the mid-13th century, mentions the Yasa. Rashid al-Din, the physician and historian who compiled his vast Compendium of Chronicles, the Jami al-Tawarik, at the Mongol court in Persia around the turn of the 14th century, describes it. Other writers, the Egyptian al-Makrisi, the Persian Merkond, add their own accounts. But these sources were written at different times, in different languages, from different perspectives, and they do not always agree. Some provisions one writer reports, another does not mention. Clauses that appear in one account contradict clauses in another. This is not unusual for medieval legal history. Oral law, customary practice, royal decree, all of these shaded into each other across the medieval world, and the clean, codified document is often a later historian's reconstruction. What matters for the 8th rung is not which specific clauses are certainly true and which are doubtfully reported. What matters is the principle they collectively gesture toward. That principle, the defensible core, the thing that multiple independent traditions agree on, even when they disagree on the details, was this: a single sovereign law. Above the tribe, above the person, applied by the Khan's authority, and not by any local chief's discretion. Before the empire, the steppe had been governed by tribal custom, by the power of whichever leader was strong enough to enforce his will, by shifting alliances and vendettas and the complicated web of obligation that ties people together when there is no state above them. You knew who your Khan was because he could take your animals and field your warriors. You obeyed because the alternative was conflict with people who lived beside you and whose horses you could see from your tent. The law was personal and local. It flexed with power. The Yasa, or rather the institution the Yasa represented, announced something different. There is a rule, and it applies to you regardless of your tribe. There is a punishment, and it will be administered regardless of who your relatives are. Theft, desertion, adultery, the killing of certain animals in the wrong manner, washing or urinating in running water, failure to return a lost slave or a stray animal to its owner. Whatever the specific clauses were, and the sources disagree on the specifics, the pattern they traced was one of predictability. You could know in advance what was forbidden. You could know in advance what the consequence was. That knowledge was itself a kind of safety, in a world where arbitrary power had been the norm. The most reliably attested and the most consistently counterintuitive feature attributed to the Yasa was its treatment of religion. The Mongols exempted priests, monks, imams, and lamas from taxation. They did not, in the classic imperial period, compel conversion. Different sources report different expressions of this. Genghis Khan is described as respectful toward religious leaders he encountered, curious about their ideas, unwilling to offend the divine powers of any tradition through casual disrespect. Whether this reflected genuine pluralism or careful pragmatism, or both at once, is a question historians continue to debate. But the policy itself is well attested across multiple traditions. Buddhist monks in China, Nestorian Christians in Central Asia, Muslim imams in Persia, Tibetan lamas all report varying degrees of official tolerance and tax exemption. To be a religious leader under the Mongol Empire was, in many circumstances, to be protected by the state that had conquered your world. This was not universal. It did not mean there was no violence against religious communities. There was, especially in the conquest phase. It did not mean all religions were treated identically in all times and places across the empire's vast diversity. But as a governing policy, broadly applied, it was extraordinary for the age and thoroughly practical. A conquered population that can pray as it chooses is easier to govern than one that has been told to change its gods. The Yasa's religious tolerance was, in the end, an administrative efficiency. The Secret History of the Mongols, the chronicle written in Mongolian around 1252, a generation after Genghis Khan's death, the single richest insider account of the empire's formation, records the language of exception and forgiveness that existed alongside punishment. Loyal followers and valued servants are promised that their faults will be forgiven, one phrase from the Secret History putting it as forgiven up to 9 times. The 9-fold forgiveness. A darken's privilege. The exemption that could be granted for service or skill or heroism, sometimes promised to carry through 9 generations. 9 was a number of significance in the steppe world, a full, complete, sufficient number, the number before 10, the number that filled a category. To be forgiven up to 9 times was to be nearly invincible inside the law. But nearly invincible was not invincible. The 10th transgression was not covered. The law could reach even the forgiven, and the Khan's own sons and grandsons were, rhetorically at least, subject to it. Whether this rhetoric translated into practice is another matter. Princes fell and rose for complicated reasons, and power has always bent rules in its own direction. But the idea, the stated principle, was radical. The man at the summit stood beneath the same code as the man at the base. That is the Yasa, seen honestly, as a principle more than a document, as an aspiration more than a fully enforced reality, as a genuine institutional innovation built on uncertain textual ground. The code we can read about without being able to read. And now we come to the summit, the 9th rung, the last level. There was a man at the top. There was always a man at the top. But the question of how he got there, and how he stayed there, and what held the whole counted ladder beneath him in place, that question is the one the whole climb has been building toward. The title was Khagan, Great Khan, the ruler above all the rulers, the summit above all the summits. And to understand what the summit meant, you have to understand that reaching it was not simply a matter of birth. It was a matter of assembly. The Kurultai, the great convening of the empire's princes, commanders, and noyans, the named leaders of the decimal structure, the men who had been appointed to their tumens and their mingghans by the Khan's authority, and who now gathered to exercise their one supreme collective privilege, the choosing of the next Khan. The new ruler was raised up by acclamation, lifted in the formal imagery on a felt blanket by the gathered princes, his name spoken, his authority confirmed. He was not simply inherited from his father, he was chosen from among the eligible, those of the right bloodline, the ruling house, by the gathered representatives of the empire's elite. The Kurultai gave the Khan his legitimacy. Without it, a man was only a claimant, Temujin had stood at the centre of such a gathering in 1206. This was the Kurultai at which the steppe was unified, the tribes dissolved into the decimal ladder, and the man who had spent decades fighting his way up from a boy whose father was poisoned and whose people were temporarily scattered, that man was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, or sometimes translated as fierce ruler. The exact etymology is debated, and in the sleep of history the precise meaning matters less than the weight of the moment. A gathering of every significant power on the Mongolian steppe, raising one man above them all, agreeing, for now, to be counted under him. That word, for now, is important. After Genghis Khan died in 1227, a Kurultai was required to confirm the next Khan. Gede, one of Genghis's sons, the one Genghis himself had indicated as his preferred successor, was confirmed at a Kurultai in 1229. 2 years passed between the death and the confirmation, while the empire waited, governed by regents and held together by its decimal structure and its yam, until the assembly could convene and the acclamation could be given. This was the system working as designed. But it was also the system carrying its own fault line. The Kurultai's power came from the requirement for consensus among the princes. But the eligible pool was large. Every son of Genghis Khan had a theoretical claim, and the steppe tradition that all sons inherit meant the empire's territory was divided among the ruling family as appanages, each branch holding its own people and lands. When the great Khan died, those branch princes had to agree on a successor. They rarely agreed easily. The campaigns into Europe in the early 1240s, which had pushed as far west as Poland and Hungary, deeper into Europe than any Mongol army had reached before or would reach again, halted and then reversed when Gede died in 1241. The army turned back. The princes were required at a Kurultai. Whether Europe was truly spared by that withdrawal, or whether other factors would have slowed the campaign in any case, is a question historians continue to debate. But the mechanics are clear. A summons to the Kurultai outweighed a campaign that was mid-conquest. The assembly was that important. The legitimacy it conferred was that necessary. As the empire expanded and time passed, the branches of the ruling family grew more powerful, more independent, more likely to fight among themselves over the succession rather than agree at a Kurultai. The institution that had created unity by requiring consent became the mechanism of fracture when consent could not be achieved. The elective quality that had prevented simple hereditary monarchy, that had kept the summit accessible to the most capable eligible man rather than simply the oldest son, also meant that there was always more than one man who thought he was the right choice. And when two men think they are each the right choice, and each has armies and tumens and the loot shares and the yam in his own territory, the result is not a peaceful Kurultai, the result is civil war. The empire would split. It would fragment into successor khanates, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde on the western steppe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty in China, each ruled by a branch of the family of Genghis Khan, each inheriting part of the decimal structure, part of the yam, part of the Yasa's authority, but no longer unified under a single Kurultai that could bind them all. The pull the number out problem. Remove the single counted ladder, the single great Khan above it, the single Kurultai that confirmed him, and what remains are several ladders, each counting itself, each claiming the summit. But that is the end of the story, and we have been climbing toward the summit, not descending from it. At the summit, in the years when the empire was still whole, the great Khan lived in the vast imperial ordo. The moving city of felt tents and carts and herds and captives and keshig guardsmen, that was the court, the government, the household, and the army headquarters in one. It moved with the seasons, as all the steppe had always moved. Even at the top of the largest land empire the world had seen, the life was still a nomad's life in its bones, felt walls, cold mornings, the smell of animals and fire and fermented milk, the night sky that was the same night sky the arat saw from his own tent 1,000 miles away. The Khan had his keshig around him, the 10,000 guardsmen in their rotating shifts, the night watch at the tent door, the sons of commanders learning the empire from the inside of its most intimate chamber. He had his noyans with their appanages and their tumens, each one a compact of loyalty and loot share and mutual need. He had his yams stretched across the steppe and beyond, waiting to carry his words to every corner of his count. He had the kubhur assessors and the tamga collectors and the ortok merchants moving his silver and his goods along the protected routes. He had the yasa, whatever it said, whatever it meant, as the rhetorical claim that even he stood beneath a law. And he had the Kurultai behind him, the memory of acclamation, the legitimacy that had been given, and could, in theory, be withheld. All of that rested, in the end, on the arban. On 10 men who had been told they were no longer a tribe, who had been placed next to 9 other men they might not have known before, who had been handed a liability, if one of you runs, all of you answer, and an identity, you are a 10, and above you is 100, and above that is 1,000, and above that is a tumen, and above that is the Khan. Every order the Khan issued had to pass through that chain. Every tribute the empire collected had to be counted up through that chain. Every soldier the army fielded was one of those 10 men, bringing his remount string and his composite bow, and his dried curd and his conditional loyalty to a unit that would place him inside 100, that would place him inside 1,000, that would place him inside a tumen, that would march or camp or hold or strike on the word of a man. It would never see. Pull the number out, and the empire falls apart. That was always the truth beneath the conquest. Genghis Khan did not build an empire with terror alone. He built it with arithmetic, with the radical act of counting people and giving each count a set of obligations and a set of rights, a loot share, a darkhan's exemption, a keshig appointment, a paisa that opened gates, and then enforcing the count with enough consistency that people began to believe the count was real. You belonged to a number. The number told you what you owed and what you were owed. And across the whole width of the steppe and the settled cities and the mountain passes and the Silk Road caravans and the relay stations with their waiting horses, the same counting system was doing the same work. The herder at his irag and the guardsman at his night watch, and the merchant with his tamga receipt, and the noyan with his share of the loot, and the kuggan in his felt ordo. All of them were nodes in the same counted network. All of them were numbers in the same great ledger that nobody could see in full, but that held them all in place. We followed the captive into the war camp, where skill became survival. We followed the herder into the arban of 10, where belonging meant liability, and the soldier and the neighbour were the same man. We climbed the decimal ladder, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, and found at each level the same principle: accountability, legibility, the known exchange of obligation for protection. We met the Darkhan, whose faults could be forgiven 9 times, and whose freedom from the common burden was the empire's way of saying it valued what he knew. We watched the Noyan divide the loot in prescribed portions, the share flowing outward and upward in a system that made loyalty profitable. We stood at the Keshig's night watch, where the sons of the empire's commanders kept the sleeping Khan and learned, in the keeping, how to command. We rode the yam from station to station, carrying nothing but a metal tablet that opened every gate, crossing the steppe in weeks on horses we would never own. We paid the kubhur and the tamga and watched the Ortok merchants move silver and silk along roads made safer by the same authority that had assessed us. We stood before the yasa, or what we know of it, which is not the text but the principle, and understood that the claim of one law above tribe and person was itself a kind of power, whatever its imperfect enforcement. And we arrived, at last, at the Kurultai, where the great Khan was not simply born, but chosen, raised on felt, acclaimed by the same Noyans who owed their tumens to his appointment. That is the full climb. From the captive's fire to the Khan's ordo, from the bottom of the count to the top of the assembly. If there is another calm evening ahead of you, another gentle hour of drifting through a long, soft list of things that are true, there will be a next video waiting when this one ends. You can simply let it play and follow the thread wherever it leads. And if tonight brought you something, a word you hadn't heard before, a fact that settled quietly somewhere behind your eyes, you might leave a thought below, or a like, or find the subscribe button if this is the kind of place you want to return to. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But right now, there is nothing left to learn tonight. Nothing left to count, or carry, or owe. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop an inch closer to wherever they are resting. Feel your breath find the rhythm it finds when you stop directing it, the easy rhythm, the one your body knows without being told. The steppe is quiet. The relay stations are dark. The felt walls of the ordu soften the wind. Somewhere a horse shifts its weight. The night watch is keeping the watch. You do not have to. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.